Chapter 7. Injun Joe's Treasure. One Saturday afternoon, Tom wanted to have an adventure because he didn't want to think about Injun Joe. He went to Huck and said, "I'm going to look for treasure. Do you want to come with me?" Huck always liked an adventure. "Oh, yes," he said. "Where can we look?" "Let's start looking in the old house, near Mrs. Douglas's house. Old houses are good places for treasure," Tom answered. The boys went to the old house. They wanted to look at every room. First, they went into the kitchen, and then they went into the bedroom. Suddenly, two men came into the kitchen, Injun Joe and his friend. The boys were afraid and stayed in the bedroom very quietly. Injun Joe walked across the kitchen. "We can put our money here," he said to his friend. He started to dig under the floor with his knife. "What's this?" Injun Joe said. "I'm going to get it out." There was a big box under the floor. He opened it with his knife. There was a lot of money in the box. "Look at that money," his friend said. "Let's go now. We can come back and get it tomorrow." "No," Injun Joe said. "We're going to take it with us now. We can take it to that place. You know, the place under the cross." Then the men went out of the house. Injun Joe talked quietly to his friend. The boys listened and were afraid. Tom said, "Did you hear that? He wants to kill us." They went out of the house quietly and went home. The boys were afraid of Injun Joe, but they wanted to find his treasure. They watched his house every night, but they didn't see Injun Joe or his treasure. Chapter 8. Becky's Adventure Day. In August, Becky's family came back from their vacation. Tom was very happy, and he didn't think about Injun Joe's treasure. Becky's adventure day was Saturday. Her mother said, "You can sleep at Susie Harper's house after your adventure." "Good," Becky said. Becky and her friends went on the river on a big boat. The boat went down the river and across it. Then it stopped. The children went out of the boat and played games near the river. In the afternoon, one boy asked, "Who wants to go to the big cave?" The children went to the cave. It was dark and cold there, but they played games. In the evening, they went back to the boat and went home. Sunday morning, Becky's mother and Aunt Polly talked to Mrs. Harper at church. Becky's mother asked, "Where's my Becky? Did she sleep at your house?" "No, she didn't," Mrs. Harper answered. "I didn't see her." Aunt Polly said, "My Tom didn't come home. Did he stay at your house?" "No, he didn't," Mrs. Harper answered. Then Aunt Polly and Becky's mother asked the children, "Did Tom and Becky come home? Did you see them on the boat?" The children answered, "No, we didn't see them, but it was dark." Then a boy said, "Maybe they're in the cave." 200 men looked for Tom and Becky in the cave. They looked for 3 days, but they didn't find them. People in the town were very sad. Chapter 9. Huck's Adventure. Huck didn't go on Becky's adventure. He stayed home and watched Injun Joe's house that night. At 11 o'clock, Injun Joe and his friend came out and walked down the street. There was a box in his friend's hands. Huck said quietly, "Maybe that's the treasure box." He went after the two men. They walked to Mrs. Douglas's house and stopped in her yard. Huck stayed behind some small trees. The men talked, and Huck listened to them. Injun Joe was angry. "I want to kill her," he said to his friend. "Mr. Douglas was bad to me. He's dead now, but I remember. There are a lot of lights in the house. Maybe her friends are visiting," Injun Joe's friend said. "We can come back tomorrow." "No," Injun Joe said. "Let's wait now." Huck liked Mrs. Douglas because she was always good to him. He wanted to help her. He quietly walked away, and then he started to run to Mr. Jones's house. Mr. Jones opened the door. "What do you want?" he asked Huck. Injun Joe and his friend are in Mrs. Douglas's yard, Huck said. They want to kill her. Can you go there and help Mrs. Douglas? Yes, my sons and I can go there, Mr. Jones answered. You can go home. In the morning, Huck went back to Mr. Jones's house. How's Mrs. Douglas? He asked. She's okay, Mr. Jones answered. The men went away because we arrived. Good, Huck said. But he was afraid of Injun Joe. Please don't say my name to Mrs. Douglas. Mr. Jones looked at him, and then he said, You aren't well. Go and sleep in my bedroom. Later, Mrs. Douglas visited Mr. Jones. You helped me yesterday night. Thank you, she said. You're a good man. Mr. Jones said, We didn't know about the men in your yard. A boy was there, and he wanted to help you. He came here, but I can't say his name. Mr. Jones and Mrs. Douglas went to church. People there talked about Tom and Becky. Mr. Jones and his sons went to the cave with the men, but on Monday morning, they went home. Huck was in bed and was very sick. The men went back to the cave, but Mrs. Douglas stayed with Huck.